In September of 2014, inside a county auction room that smelled like wet coats and old paper, a 71-year-old woman named Grace Morlan bought the dead Silverside Vinegar Works for $913. For 3 seconds, nobody made a sound. Then the room began to laugh. Not cruelly, not exactly. It was the kind of laughter people use when they do not know where else to put their grief. The Vinegar Works had been empty for 29 years. Its windows were clouded white with dust. Its roof sagged over the bottling room. The loading dock was split by tree roots. Even the auctioneer looked embarrassed as he slid the deed across the table. Grace signed her name slowly. Then she took out a folded bank envelope, counted $900 bills, 1 10, and 3 singles, and pushed the money forward. The man sitting 2 rows behind her had stopped bidding at $900. His name was Cal Rusk, and he owned a demolition outfit outside Harrisburg. He had only wanted the copper lines, the old iron racks, and the oak fermentation barrels if they could be hauled out cheaply. Later he told people he had done Grace a favor by quitting. "Any more than 900, he said, "and you're buying a headache." Grace heard him. She did not turn around. She only picked up the key. It was not a modern key. It was long, brass, and blackened at the teeth, tied with a strip of blue surveyor's tape. It looked less like something that opened a building, and more like something pulled from the bottom of a river. That key became the whole town's joke by dinner. By the next morning, everyone in Bracken Mill, Pennsylvania, knew the story. The retired woman from Quarry Road had spent almost $1,000 on a condemned vinegar factory, 4 acres of weeds, and a tax bill large enough to bury her. The barber said she had lost her senses. The bank teller said it was sad. The mayor said nothing in public, which in a town that small meant he agreed with both of them. And for a while, the laughter made sense. Because the Silverside Vinegar Works was not just an old building. It was the place where Bracken Mill's confidence had gone to die. It opened in 1919, when the valley was still stitched with orchards, not neat supermarket orchards with 4 varieties and plastic tags, but crooked family orchards planted on hillsides, behind barns, along fence lines, and beside creek beds. They were Baldwin apples, Roxbury russets, wine saps, golden pippins, Newtown Spitzenbergs, and dozens of local varieties nobody outside the county could pronounce. Some were too ugly to sell fresh. Some were too sharp to eat out of hand. Some were so bitter they could make a child spit. But pressed, fermented, cooked down, and aged in oak, they became cider vinegar, apple butter, shrub syrup, pickled fruit, and barrel-aged reductions that hotels in Philadelphia once ordered by the rail car. For decades, Silverside ran 6 days a week from August through January. At its peak in 1958, it employed 94 people and bought apples from 127 farms within 30 miles. A worker on the bottling line could pay a mortgage. A farmer with 10 acres of odd old apple trees could keep his land. The factory turned crooked fruit into cash. That was its promise. Then the valley learned a new language: efficiency, scale, uniformity. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, packing houses began demanding apples that looked perfect in a cardboard tray. Chain groceries wanted waxed fruit with predictable size, predictable color, predictable sweetness, and predictable shipping life. Processing companies wanted concentrate by the tanker, not vinegar aged in barrels. Banks preferred growers who planted dwarf trees in laser-straight rows. Extension pamphlets praised high-yield varieties that could be sprayed, picked, boxed, and sold like machine parts. One by one, the old orchards came down. A farmer who once kept 20 apple varieties was told to keep 4, then 2, then sell the hill lot to a developer. By 1982, more than 60% of Bracken County's mixed orchards had been bulldozed, replanted, or abandoned. The apples that made Silverside valuable were the first to disappear because they were the least convenient. Too tannic, too small, too late, too soft, too difficult to explain to a buyer who only knew Red Delicious and Granny Smith. Silverside tried to survive by making cheap white vinegar for institutional kitchens. It was the worst possible compromise. The equipment was too old for modern volume and too honest for modern shortcuts. The margins collapsed. The last barrel of real cider vinegar was filled in October of 1984. The company shut down in March of 1985. The final payroll checks bounced. After that, Bracken Mill began shrinking around the empty plant. The hardware store closed first. Then the diner cut its hours. Then the school district merged with the next town over. By the 2010 census, the population had fallen under 800. The factory remained at the bend in the creek, a long brick reminder of a version of the town nobody knew how to reach anymore. So when Grace Morlan bought it, people did not just laugh at a bad investment. They laughed at the idea that anything buried that long could still be alive. The person most relieved by the laughter was Ethan Vale. Ethan was 39, clean-shaven, sharp-suited, and fluent in the confident vocabulary of outside rescue. He had been hired by the town council for $32,000 to design a redevelopment plan. His firm's office was in Philadelphia, and his proposal for Bracken Mill was simple. Stop romanticizing ruins. He called the Vinegar Works a blighted, non-performing parcel. He showed the council photos of broken windows, roof damage, and graffiti in the loading bay. He showed a chart claiming homes within half a mile of the plant sold for 22% less than comparable houses near the highway. He showed a projected tax increase if the site were cleared and leased to a regional shipping company as a cross-dock distribution center. The taxes owed on the Silverside property totaled $58,438. Demolition and environmental cleanup would cost the town nearly $110,000. But Ethan had a slide for that, too. The distribution company, he said, would bring 80 jobs and a new commercial assessment. The old plant was a memory. The warehouse was revenue. That line worked. It sounded mature. It sounded unsentimental. It sounded like the future. Grace's $913 bid interrupted the first step of his plan. She now owned the building, but the back taxes remained, and Ethan knew the clock could still beat her. He found her in the parking lot after the auction, standing beside a faded green pickup truck with rust over both wheel wells. "Mrs. Morlan," he said, with a careful softness people use when they are about to insult an old woman. "I'm worried you may not understand the liability you just assumed." Grace was looking at the key in her palm. "I understand liabilities," she said. "The roof alone could cost more than the property is worth." "That depends on what you think the property is," Ethan smiled. "The market has already answered that. No operating business has touched that plant in almost 3 decades. Grace closed her fingers around the key. The market only answers the questions it is asked. That was the first sentence about her purchase that nobody understood. Her own family did not understand it either. Grace's grandson, Nolan, drove in that night from State College, where he had just finished a degree in supply chain management. He loved his grandmother. He also believed, with the blunt certainty of 24, that she had just made the most humiliating mistake of her life. He found her at the kitchen table, not crying, not panicking, but flattening a brittle paper map under 4 coffee mugs. "Nana," he said, "people are saying you bought it for the scrap." "No," Grace said. "Cal Rusk wanted the scrap." "Then why did you buy it?" She pointed to the map. It was hand-drawn in brown ink. Along the creek and the slopes behind the factory were tiny marks, each one labeled with a tree name and a year. Nolan leaned closer. Baldwin, planted 1907. Harrison, planted 1911. Foxwhelp, planted 1916. Ashmead's Kernel, planted 1924. Some labels had small circles beside them. Some had crosses. Some had the words, "Good Bearer," "Late Frost Survivor," or "Best Acid." "What is this?" Nolan asked. "Your great-grandfather's orchard ledger," Grace said. "He mapped every tree that supplied Silverside before the county paved the lower road." Nolan stared at her. "A map of trees?" "A map of the factory's ingredients." Then she opened a narrow cedar box. Inside were bundles of dormant apple scion wood, each wrapped in waxed cloth and labeled in Grace's tight handwriting. Beside them were envelopes of dried yeast scrapings taken from old barrels, notes on grafting dates, acidity readings, and recipes copied from the plant's former vinegar master. Nolan tried to be gentle. "Nana, I'm not saying this isn't interesting, but you can't pay $58,000 in taxes with tree sticks." Grace lifted one of the wrapped cuttings. "That's exactly what people said the first time they cut them." To Nolan it looked like nostalgia arranged in a box. Old paper, old wood, old names. The kind of thing a museum might label and dust. To Grace, it was inventory. She had spent 46 years as a county horticulture aide. She had inspected orchards, helped farmers graft trees, catalogued blights, tested soil, and watched the valley forget what it had once known. She understood something Ethan's charts did not. The useful life of an apple variety is not over because a grocery buyer cannot stack it. Some fruit is not made for shelves. Some fruit is made for transformation. The first month, Grace did not touch the factory roof. That drove Ethan crazy. He had expected emergency repairs, contractor bids, a loan application, some visible sign that she intended to turn the building into a business. Instead, every morning at sunrise, she walked the 4 acres behind Silverside with pruning shears, flagging tape, and a notebook. Nolan followed because someone had to make sure she did not fall through the weeds. The land looked worthless. Sumac, briars, Queen Anne's lace, collapsed fencing, a drainage ditch full of beer cans. Grace saw a different map. She found rootstock sprouting from the stumps of trees cut down 30 years earlier. She found 3 abandoned apple trees, still bearing small green fruit. She found wild grapes on the old rail fence, mint near the spring house, and a row of elderberries behind the bottling room. Most important, she found that the hillside soil was alive. No one sprayed this ground for 29 years, she told Nolan, crumbling the dark soil in her hand. No one pushed it. No one stripped it. It has been resting. Resting is what people say when nothing is happening, Nolan said. Grace looked up at the blank factory windows. Only if they don't know how roots work. That became her real plan. Not a grand opening, not a ribbon cutting, not a 5-year redevelopment chart. Roots. She spent the last of her savings on fencing, compost, grafting wax, and 2 used stainless tanks from a dairy farm. She paid a neighbor with a tractor to clear the brush, but only where she marked it. She grafted Harrison, Baldwin, and Foxwhelp scions onto young rootstock. She pruned the 3 surviving trees until they looked almost human, scarred and awkward, and standing again. Nolan helped her because guilt is sometimes the first form of faith. He dug holes. He carried water. He repaired fence posts. He complained. Then, little by little, he began to notice. The old trees produced apples unlike anything in a supermarket. One was hard, bitter, and floral. One smelled faintly of pineapple. One was ugly as a potato and made the best juice he had ever tasted. Grace did not smile when he admitted that. She only said, "The market forgot how to taste." While Grace worked the land, Ethan worked the town. He found an ordinance from 1978 requiring any owner of an industrial parcel inside the borough to present a viable commercial use within 1 year of transfer, or face escalating fines and potential seizure. The law had been written for chemical storage companies. Ethan repurposed it for Grace. At the October council meeting, he presented his case. He was polished. He was careful. He called Grace a respected resident. He called her project admirable. Then he described it as a garden. A garden, he explained, could not answer Bracken Mill's fiscal crisis. A handful of heritage apple trees could not fund road repair. A retired woman with pruning shears could not compete with a signed letter of intent from a logistics company. The question, Ethan said, is whether Bracken Mill wants to be governed by memory or by math. The room nodded. That was the danger of Ethan. He knew how to make surrender sound responsible. The council gave Grace until February 1st to pay the outstanding taxes and present evidence of a working business. If she failed, the town would begin proceedings to seize and clear the property. Grace had 1 winter. She also had no product. The surviving trees gave enough apples for test batches, not revenue. The new grafts would take years to bear. The building still smelled like dust and mouse nests. The bottling line had not moved since 1985. Then on the first hard frost of November, Grace opened the factory. The brass key fought the lock for nearly a minute. Nolan was ready to call a locksmith when the bolt finally gave. Cold air rolled out, as if the building had been holding its breath. Inside, everything was gray. Gray light, gray dust, gray pigeons lifting from the rafters. The old oak barrels sat in 2 long rows, their iron hoops rusted, their staves dry as bone. The bottling machine leaned under a tarp. A chalkboard still listed batch numbers from the last winter the plant had operated. Grace stood in the doorway without speaking. Nolan expected sadness. Instead, she whispered, "They left the barrels." 2 days later, the first volunteer arrived. His name was Walt Keener. He was 81 and had worked at Silverside from the time he was 17 until the day the checks bounced. He walked in with a thermos, a broom, and a canvas tool roll. "I heard you got the door open," he said. "Figured the place would need someone who remembered which pipes not to trust." Grace handed him a dust mask. By the end of the week, there were 9 of them. Former bottling workers, a retired plumber, a woman who had labeled jars in 1962 and still remembered the rhythm of the line, an electrician who knew exactly why the west wall outlet sparked when it rained. They were not investors. They were not employees. They were the knowledge Ethan had not put on a slide. They cleaned the tanks, tightened belts, patched steam lines, scraped labels off old glass, and rolled the best barrels outside to swell back under wet burlap. Walt found the old vinegar mother in a cracked ceramic crock at the back of the fermentation room. Grace tested it, fed it, and watched it bloom. Nolan built a simple website because that was the only part of the plan he understood. He photographed Grace's hands wrapping scion wood. He photographed Walt standing beside the barrels. He wrote about bitter apples, abandoned orchards, and vinegar made from fruit too complicated for the supermarket aisle. They made 3 products that winter: a barrel-aged cider vinegar from the surviving trees, a dark apple butter cooked for 12 hours in a steam kettle, and a sharp drinking shrub made with elderberries from behind the bottling room. The quantities were tiny: 240 bottles of vinegar, 310 jars of apple butter, 180 bottles of shrub. Grace priced them high because she had to. $18 for vinegar, $14 for apple butter, $16 for shrub. In Bracken Mill, those numbers sounded absurd. At the holiday craft market, people tasted the vinegar on little squares of bread. Their faces changed before their opinions did. It was not like the vinegar they knew. It was bright, smoky, tannic, almost alive. It tasted like an orchard floor after rain. They sold some, not enough. By January 10th, Nolan calculated their revenue at $7,800. After supplies, almost nothing remained. They owed $58,438. Ethan stopped pretending to be patient. He scheduled the final hearing for January 28th. The distribution company had extended its offer, but only if the site could be cleared by summer. He had updated renderings now: clean metal walls, loading bays, employee parking, a stormwater pond. A future without splinters. 3 nights before the hearing, Nolan checked the website inbox from Grace's kitchen. Most messages were local orders, spam, and one complaint that the apple butter had sold out. Then he saw the subject line: procurement inquiry, Silverside barrel-aged cider vinegar. The message came from a buyer at North Star Provisions, a regional specialty grocer with 46 stores across Pennsylvania, Maryland, New Jersey, and Virginia. A chef in Lancaster had bought one of the bottles, used it in a winter menu, and mentioned it in a trade newsletter. The buyer wanted samples, wholesale pricing, and proof of capacity. Nolan laughed once, because it seemed safer than hoping. "We don't have capacity," he said. Grace read the message twice. "No," she said, "but we have a crop map." That sentence became the second thing nobody understood. The next morning, Grace and Nolan drove from farm to farm with the old orchard ledger. They asked landowners about abandoned trees at the edges of their fields. They found more than anyone expected. Baldwin on the Miller place, 2 Harrison trees behind a collapsed barn, a stand of crabapples near the old church road, 6 unknown cider apples on a ridge nobody had harvested since the 1970s. By the time they answered North Star, they could document enough surviving fruit in the valley to expand production the following fall. Not industrially, not infinitely, but honestly. Grace sent samples overnight. The council hearing was packed. Nearly half the town came, partly for the argument, and partly because people wanted to see how the story ended. Ethan stood at the front with his laptop open, and the distribution center glowing behind him on the screen. He spoke beautifully. He spoke of tax stability, employment, infrastructure, and the courage to make practical decisions. He praised Grace's dedication. He praised Silverside's history. Then he asked the town not to confuse affection with economics. This community, he said, cannot survive on symbolism. That line drew applause. Then the council chair turned to Grace. Mrs. Morlan, have you secured funds sufficient to satisfy the tax lien? Grace stood. She wore a gray wool coat and held the brass key in her right hand. No, she said. Not today. Ethan lowered his eyes, almost respectfully. It was over. Then Grace added, but my grandson has a document the council should hear before it votes. Nolan stood with a printed email trembling in both hands. The room went still. He read the first paragraph too quickly, then stopped, swallowed, and began again. North Star Provisions had tasted the samples. The buyer described the vinegar as one of the most distinctive regional products they had reviewed in years. They were prepared to launch Silverside in 46 stores as a limited heritage line, beginning with an initial purchase order for the next available production run. Nolan's voice cracked on the numbers. 6,000 bottles of barrel-aged cider vinegar at $6.80 wholesale. 3,000 jars of apple butter at $5.75 wholesale. 2,000 bottles of elderberry shrub at $6.10 wholesale. Total initial order, $70,250. The number did not sound dramatic when Nolan said it. That made it more powerful. $70,250. More than the tax lien. More than Ethan's consulting fee. More than enough to prove that Grace had not bought a relic. She had bought a production system nobody else recognized. For a few seconds, the only sound in the room was the projector fan pushing air through Ethan's bright image of loading docks. Then Walt Keener began to clap. Slowly, once, then again. Not like a man applauding a performance. Like a man testing whether his hands still knew how to make a factory sound. Others joined him. Former workers first, then farmers, then the barber, then people who had laughed in September and suddenly looked as if they wanted to take the sound back. Ethan did not argue with the email. He could not. His entire position had depended on the idea that memory had no market value. Grace had just placed a purchase order beside his projection, and the projection looked strangely weightless. The council voted to postpone seizure proceedings and grant Grace 18 months to satisfy the lien and operate under review. The wire from North Star arrived 9 days later. Grace paid the taxes in full, with a cashier's check. Then she did something Ethan would never have put in a redevelopment plan. She wrote $500 checks to every volunteer who had helped open the plant. Walt tried to refuse his. Grace said, "You remembered where the pipes went. That's worth more than consulting." By the next fall, Silverside was running again. Not like 1958. It never became that, and Grace never wanted it to. She hired 14 people for harvest and bottling season at $16 an hour. Nolan stayed to manage orders and track farm contracts. Walt became plant supervisor, though he insisted on being called the old nuisance. The first real production year yielded 11,000 bottles, not millions. Grace capped growth at what the valley could supply without stripping it. She refused concentrate. She refused artificial coloring. She refused a private equity offer that arrived in year 3, with a number so large Nolan had to sit down. "The value," she told him, "is in not becoming what killed us." That was the part Bracken Mill slowly learned. Silverside did not save the town by becoming huge. It saved the town by making the small things valuable again. Farmers who had ignored old trees began pruning them. 2 families replanted cider orchards on hillsides that had been hay for decades. A local carpenter built bottle crates. A printer reopened part-time to make labels. The diner started serving pork with Silverside apple butter. The grocery shelf that once carried only national brands made room for valley products. Money did not flood Bracken Mill. It circulated. There is a difference. 5 years after Grace bought the plant, the population had not boomed. There were no glossy magazine spreads about a miracle town. But the school bus had 3 more stops. The hardware store reopened 3 mornings a week. A young couple bought the old Larkin house near the factory for 12% above asking, and nobody made jokes about the smell of vinegar anymore. Ethan's distribution center was built in another county. It employed fewer people than promised. Most of the jobs were part-time. Nobody in Bracken Mill celebrated that. Grace did not need him to be ruined for her to be right. That was another thing people misunderstood about her. She had never been fighting a man. She had been fighting a way of seeing. Ethan saw a dead factory because his numbers were trained to count what could be scaled, cleared, leased, and standardized. Grace saw living value because she knew how to count what was dormant. A rootstock under weeds, a bitter apple no supermarket wanted, a barrel culture asleep in a crock, the memory in an old worker's hands, a town's shame waiting to become usefulness again. When Grace died at 86, she left Silverside to Nolan, with 3 conditions written into her will. The plant could not be sold to a publicly traded corporation. The orchard ledger had to be updated every year, and every batch label had to name the farms whose fruit went into it. Nolan kept the brass key in a glass case near the front door, not because it opened the factory anymore. The lock had been replaced years before. He kept it there because it opened the town. The truth is, Grace Morlan did not buy a dead vinegar factory for $913. She bought a root system. She bought the crooked trees, the sleeping barrels, the buried knowledge, and the stubborn fact that some forms of wealth look worthless until the right person knows how to wake them. A spreadsheet can count what stands above ground. Grace understood what survives underneath. And in Bracken Mill, what survived underneath was enough.